I said I would terminate my pregnancy if the baby had a genetic condition, and now my husband is considering divorce. Just a few hours ago, the words of that argument, which seemed to have opened an insurmountable wound in our marriage, were still echoing in my mind. The house had fallen into a sepulchral silence, and every corner reminded me of the echo of my husband's voice, laden with disbelief and pain. That night, as darkness spread across the window, I found myself mentally repeating my arguments, trying to understand where my convictions came from and how I had come to believe that the responsibility of having a child implied making such radical decisions. The revelation of my pregnancy, which had initially been a cause for joy and hope, turned into a minefield of conflicting emotions. For weeks I had imagined the baby's arrival, the first steps, family laughter, and yet my determination to avoid any possibility of future suffering had become an overwhelming burden. Wasn't it, I thought in those moments of introspection, a matter of foresight and responsibility? The image of a child facing medical or developmental difficulties terrified me, and in my mind, the only reasonable option was to prevent that suffering before it began. The conflict, however, was not limited to my fears. The next day, when I tried to face the situation, I found a house imbued with tension. My husband, with his gaze fixed on the void in the living room, appeared distant, almost irredeemably hurt. His silence was as eloquent as his reproaches. It wasn't long before heated conversations erupted, in which words became sharp knives. He insisted that every life, regardless of its difficulties, had unconditional value, and that labeling a human being as undesirable in advance was a form of eugenics that attacked the very essence of love. During those moments, I wondered if I had failed to communicate the complexity of my feelings. My arguments, based on cold logic and at the same time imbued with a deep fear of the unknown, clashed head-on with his convictions of unconditional love. In the midst of this whirlwind of conflicting emotions, I decided to seek refuge in the solitude of my room. There, in front of the mirror, I tried to reconstruct the image of the woman I used to be, the one who had dreamed of a family without constraints, but who now found herself forced to rethink the meaning of motherhood and commitment. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every minute felt eternal, and in the twilight, my thoughts intertwined into a labyrinth of doubts and fears. I recalled past conversations, moments when my intuition and my logic had clashed with unexpected feelings, and I wondered if perhaps my vision of responsibility was, in part, a mechanism to avoid uncertainty and vulnerability. Was it truly selfish to want to avoid suffering? Or was I allowing fear to dictate the course of my life and that of my future child? At dawn, with the sunlight timidly filtering through the curtains, I decided that I needed answers. With a mixture of determination and anxiety, I grabbed my phone and called a close friend, someone who had always known how to listen without judgment. For long hours, we talked about ethics, the implications of selective reproduction, and the social pressure that sometimes pushes us to make drastic decisions. My friend told me about studies, real cases, and how at times the pursuit of perfection becomes a destructive spiral that affects the entire family. Her words, full of empathy and reflection, made me see that perhaps, in my eagerness to protect everyone, I was ignoring the inherent complexity of life. Meanwhile, my husband was locked in his own thoughts. I remember having seen him flipping through old family albums, as if searching in the past for some sign that love could overcome even the most abysmal differences. His silences became so intense that I felt that in every pause there was a grievance, a desire to return to what once was. However, the gap between our convictions seemed to widen with every passing hour, and the uncertainty about our future became almost palpable. I then decided to arrange an appointment with a counselor specialized in genetics and family ethics, hoping to find somewhere a framework that could help us both understand the implications of what we were experiencing. During the consultation, delicate topics were addressed: women's autonomy, the moral dilemmas inherent in prenatal selection, and the importance of emotional preparation for facing possible difficult realities. I left that consultation with my heart even more confused, but with the certainty that life was full of nuances and that no decision was as simple as it initially seemed. Uncertainty took over my days. As the pregnancy progressed, every medical appointment, every ultrasound, became a constant reminder of the duality of my existence. On one hand, The miracle of life filled me with wonder and hope. On the other, the fear of facing a complex and at times painful reality paralyzed me. The nights turned into endless sessions of reflection in which every decision, every unspoken word seemed to carry an unbearable weight. In the midst of this emotional whirlwind, my husband and I began, albeit forcefully, to seek moments of sincere dialogue. The conversations, sometimes brief and other times lengthy, were filled with awkward pauses and glances that said everything without the need for words. We were torn between the desire to stay united by love and the fear of not being able to reconcile two visions of the future that were so diametrically opposed. Every argument, every reproach left invisible scars that threatened to define our destiny. Today, as I look out the window, I feel the rain beginning to fall, as if the sky shared my melancholy and the uncertainty of what is to come. I am at a crossroads between reason and feeling, between the desire to protect what has not yet been born and the need to accept life in all its complexity. The question persists, echoing in every corner of my being. How is it possible to love and yet fear the inevitable? The answer seems elusive, like a whisper in the winds that vanishes before it can be fully understood. Even without a clear end on the horizon, I continue along this path full of questions, hoping to find amidst the chaos a reason that will allow us to find a meeting point, a way to transform our differences into an opportunity to grow, without losing sight of the essence of what it means to be human. The decisions that still must be made stand before me, and in each of them is reflected the weight of life, the fragility of bonds, and the unyielding strength of love, that love which, despite the storms, insists on seeking the light. The morning after the last encounter, the atmosphere in the house seemed charged with a palpable electricity, as if every object and every shadow had been imbued with the tension that enveloped us. While the rain persisted in blurring the outlines of the city, I found myself engulfed in a whirlwind of contradictory emotions, trying to make sense of what had happened. My husband's words echoed in my mind, and every memory of our past together made me question if, in some forgotten corner, there still remained an unbreakable bond. I woke up early, and with the bitter taste of uncertainty, I decided to go for a walk. The wet streets reflected the melancholy of my inner self. As I walked aimlessly, my thoughts became entangled in memories and hypothetical futures. Was my vision of maternal responsibility as insensitive as he believed, or was it a reflection of a deep fear of the unknown? Every step reminded me that life, in its complexity, rarely offered clear answers, and that moral dilemmas could be as dark and confusing as the sky that stretched over the city. I returned home with the firm intention of finding a space for dialogue. I decided to write a letter in which I would express my feelings and concerns without the burden of direct confrontation. With a trembling pen in my hand, I began to outline my fears, my hopes, and my doubts. In each line, the ink seemed to capture the duality of my existence, the rational part that sought to protect the future being, and the emotional part that yearned for unconditional love and understanding. The letter became a raw and honest reflection of my soul, a sort of confession that I hoped would be understood without prejudice or condemnation. Later, in the living room, my husband was lost in his own thoughts. I saw him going through old clippings and photographs, perhaps trying to find in those memories some indication of the happiness we once shared. In a hesitant voice, he asked me if I still believed in the possibility of reconciling our differences. His eyes, usually full of life, now reflected a sadness and disillusionment that deeply wounded me. I replied that my convictions had not changed, but that in some corner of my heart I longed to find a bridge that could help us understand each other, despite the discrepancies that seemed insurmountable. The afternoon passed in a succession of silent moments and measured gestures. At lunchtime, as the aroma of coffee mingled with the distant sound of rain hitting the windows, I attempted to start a conversation about the future. We talked about the upcoming medical consultation scheduled for the following week, where a genetic specialist would explain the possibilities and risks of the situation. My husband, with a tone oscillating between resignation and restrained fury, barely dared to utter a word. I, on the other hand, wavered between the hope of finding answers and the fear that each consultation would only widen the distance growing between us. During those days, I began attending personal counseling sessions in search of clarity and support. In the warmth of an office illuminated by the soft light of dusk, a therapist specialized in ethical and family dilemmas invited me to explore my feelings from a broader perspective. Together, we dissected every thought, every fear, and discovered that my stance, as rational as it might seem, was tinged with insecurities and a deep longing to control the uncontrollable. The conversation became a mirror that forced me to confront uncomfortable truths about myself, and though the answers were as elusive as the morning fog, I felt a little more prepared to face the dilemma ahead. The atmosphere at home remained a silent battlefield. At times, my husband and I exchanged glances that spoke more than any words could. One night, after dining in near-deafening silence, he stood up and walked to the window, watching the rain with an expression of ineffable pain. I approached him, and without speaking, we remained there, sharing a moment of profound vulnerability. In that instant, I understood that the conflict was not solely about our ideological differences, but was a reflection of wounds accumulated over the years, wounds now torn open by the force of uncertainty. With the medical consultation approaching, we decided to attend together, though the atmosphere was thick with tension that seemed to shake the very foundations of our home. The specialist welcomed us with a calm and professional demeanor, explaining in detail the possible scenarios and the ethical implications of each decision. As he spoke, I felt his words turn into a distant echo, as if reality was filtering through a veil of doubts. My husband, visibly affected, clung to every piece of information, searching for an anchor to hold on to his principles. I, however, was caught between relentless logic and the fragility of emotions that with each passing moment threatened to overwhelm rationality. That night, back home, the dimness seemed to multiply the shadows and silences. In the solitude of my room, I opened my notebook once again and began to write non-stop, attempting to capture in words the internal chaos consuming me. The lines flowed frantically, intertwining fear, uncertainty, and hope in every paragraph. I did not know if I would ever fully understand the crossroads I was at, but something within me insisted on seeking the light, on holding on to the possibility of a future where we could both find peace, even if the solution seemed as elusive as the end of a labyrinth. The following day arrived with a mix of resolutions and renewed doubts. I walked toward the medical consultation with my heart racing, fully aware that every answer could change the course of our lives. Upon arrival, I was greeted in a bright room decorated with plants that seemed to symbolize hope. As I waited, I recalled those rainy afternoons where each drop was a metaphor for life, filled with possibilities and, at the same time, uncertainty. I felt as though I was standing at the threshold of change, unsure whether it would lead to mutual understanding or an irreversible separation. The day unfolded between technical explanations, ethical debates, and silences heavy with meaning. As the consultation progressed, I noticed that both my husband and I struggled to maintain a balance between reason and emotion. The information we received was as complex as our own situation, and every word from the specialist became a mirror reflecting our fears and desires. The afternoon stretched on, and with each passing minute, the weight of the decision seemed to grow, reminding us that sometimes there are no definitive answers, only an endless path of introspection and learning. As we left the medical center, the golden light of sunset painted the city's contours, yet within me, the same uncertainty as always reigned. We walked in silence, each lost in our own thoughts, knowing that everything we had experienced so far was merely the beginning of a journey filled with unanswered questions. The rain had stopped, but the echo of each drop lingered, like a reminder that life. Dawn timidly peeked through that morning, as the overcast sky seemed to mirror the chaos of my thoughts. As I opened my eyes, the house lay in heavy silence, as if every corner still held the echo of disputes and unspoken words that lingered in the air. I walked slowly down the hallway, feeling how each step reminded me of the words that, not long ago, had divided the home that had once been a refuge of companionship. The faint morning glow cast elongated shadows on the walls, and in each shadow seemed to hide an unanswered question. As I prepared tea in the kitchen, my hands trembled slightly. It wasn't the cold that unsettled me, but the uncertainty of a future unfolding before me, filled with questions. The routine of breakfast turned into a ritual of introspection. Each sip of tea pulled me into memories of shared moments, of laughter and closeness that now seemed so distant, as if they had belonged to another life. In that moment, the house ceased to be just a physical space and became a stage for clashing emotions, where hope battled against fear. I decided to go for a walk through the rain-dampened streets. The rain had ceased, but the air still smelled of moisture and unfulfilled promises. I wandered through avenues where the distant murmur of the city blended with my own thoughts, and with each step, I tried to reconstruct the map of my convictions. The faces I passed on the street seemed oblivious to the inner storm consuming me, and yet, in the gaze of a passerby, I glimpsed the fragility and strength of the everyday. The ambivalence of life was evident at every turn, in the innocent laughter of a child, in the kind gesture of a stranger, in the fleeting intersection of two lost souls. Upon returning, the atmosphere at home had become thick with almost tangible tension. My husband sat in the living room, facing the window, as if the rain still sought to erase the traces of a heated argument. His eyes, fixed on the gray horizon, reflected a mixture of pain and resignation that chilled me to the bone. Without words, silence became our only interlocutor, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a glimmer of the companionship we once shared in his gaze. But that light vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving me alone with the heavy certainty that wounds do not heal through mere silence. I decided to return to old habits in an attempt to find solace. I took out my notebook, the one that had been a witness to my joys and fears, and sat at my desk, writing without restraint. The words poured out like a torrent, capturing my confusion and my yearning to understand how love and despair could coexist in the same moment. Every phrase reflected the internal struggle between the logic of my convictions and the warmth of the affection that had once defined me. In those lines, I tried to draw a bridge between what I wanted and what I had to face, without being able to bring the two shores fully together. The afternoon moved forward with slow, painful cadence. I decided to attend another individual therapy session, seeking in the voice of a professional even a brief moment of illumination in the path where I felt so lost. In the consultation, amid a conversation filled with silences and revelations, the therapist invited me to explore my deepest fears, the fear of losing myself, the anguish of being unable to protect what had not yet been born, and the uncertainty of how my decisions would shape my life. That discussion, so raw and honest, left me with more questions than answers, but also gave me the certainty that, amid the chaos, there was space for self-acceptance and change. Night arrived unannounced, wrapping up the hopes and fears of an entire day. In the living room, as my husband browsed through old photo albums with a distant gaze, I decided to speak once more, attempting to open a door to dialogue that had seemed shut tight. The words flowed between us like discordant notes, and for moments it became clear that, despite the pain, there was still in both of us a lingering desire to find one another again. We spoke about the upcoming medical consultation, the need to understand the ethical implications of our situation, and how the future appeared as uncertain as the shadows cast upon the walls of our home. Absorbed in a world that no longer included me, the screen's dim glow cast faint reflections on his face, highlighting the deep lines of worry that had settled there in recent weeks. I hesitated in the doorway, debating whether to break the silence or let it stretch on, another wall between us. But the words refused to form, dissolving before they could escape my lips. Instead, I walked past him, retreating once again to the solitude of our home's quietest corner. The weight of uncertainty bore down on me, making every step feel heavier. I had hoped that my walk through the city would bring me clarity, a fresh perspective, but all I had found was the echo of my own doubts. I sat at my desk and ran my fingers over the cover of my notebook, hesitating before opening it. What was I trying to capture? Understanding? Resolution? Or simply a place to pour out the emotions I could not voice aloud? I let the pen glide over the paper, writing down thoughts as they came, untangling the knots in my mind. What happens when love is not enough? When two people who once stood side by side begin to walk in opposite directions? The questions had no answers, only the weight of their presence, pressing down on my chest. The night stretched on, blending into the early hours of the morning. Sleep eluded me, replaced by an overwhelming awareness of the distance between my husband and me. We were two people sharing a house, but no longer sharing a life. The warmth that once connected us had faded into something cold and unfamiliar. And yet, beneath it all, I could still sense the remnants of what had been. The quiet understanding, the shared laughter, the certainty that we were meant to face the world together. But certainty had abandoned us. In its place, there was only a deep and growing chasm, one that neither of us seemed to know how to cross. After that conversation, I withdrew to my room, where the intimacy of silence invited me to reflect on the course of my days. I opened my notebook once more and, under the soft glow of a lamp, continued writing at an unhurried pace, allowing the ink to capture every fragment of my emotions. The pages filled with doubts, with memories that reminded me how fleeting happiness is and how difficult it is to hold on to. Every written word was an attempt to organize the tangled emotions swirling inside me, a desperate plea to find meaning in the whirlwind of decisions and consequences. As I looked out the window, I watched the city sleep under a veil of flickering lights and wandering shadows. In that moment, I realized that my path was not linear, but a labyrinth where every step opened new possibilities and challenges. Uncertainty, rather than being an obstacle, had become an intrinsic part of my existence, a constant reminder that life is a succession of moments that transform without warning. As the night stretched on and time faded into an endless horizon, I understood that our story was only beginning to unfold. The questions lingered in the air, waiting for answers that, for now, refused to reveal themselves. With my notebook in hand and my heart filled with a mixture of resignation and longing, I came to accept that each dawn would bring new dilemmas, new conversations, and the promise of a future yet to be discovered. Each new day seemed to dissolve into a thick fog, colliding with my disoriented thoughts. The house, in its apparent tranquility, had become a collection of empty spaces where conversations and absent gestures repeated themselves in a near mechanical way. Yet, beneath all that silence, the internal noise was undeniable. My mind remained a battlefield, and the future felt like an extension of the present, riddled with questions multiplying by the hour. This morning, too, had arrived beneath gray skies, a constant reflection of my emotions. Although last night's storm had subsided, traces of that rain still lingered in the air around us. Fragmented memories took hold of me as I ate breakfast. Those moments my husband and I had once shared before everything became confusing and painful. The man who used to hold my hand with the certainty that nothing could separate us now seemed like a distant, unfamiliar figure. At the table, coffee was served just as it always had been. Yet something about that simple ritual had changed. It was no longer just a moment of calm before the storm of daily life. It had become a moment of forced reflection, as if every sip immersed me further into the contradictions of our reality. As I watched him drink from his cup, my thoughts drifted back to our arguments, to the tensions that had accumulated around our fundamental difference. Doubt had etched itself into our every gesture and word. I decided to do something completely different. I dressed quickly and, without saying a word, grabbed my keys. I stepped outside, hoping to find some kind of answer, perhaps a solution that could only be found beyond the trenches of our daily routine. As I wandered through the streets, draped in a shroud of fog, my thoughts kept circling back to the same point. How had we ended up here? It seemed as though my husband's vision of life, of family, had diverged so sharply from mine that the very act of envisioning a shared future was beginning to fade. It was impossible to ignore. He sought an emotional, immediate answer, one where love alone would be enough to face any challenge. I, on the other hand, remained trapped in the details, in the meticulous planning of every possible outcome, my mind held hostage by an abstract fear of the unknown. These two perspectives colored our conversations with mutual misunderstanding, shutting the door on empathy. Reaching the park, I sat on a bench, letting the cold winds brush against my face. I watched as families passed by with their children, and a sharp pang of uncertainty struck me. What kind of life could I offer a child if the entire universe itself seemed to bewilder me? The distance between my husband and me should have been a relief to my mind, yet my fears still lurked in the shadows. I was so immersed in these thoughts that I only realized how late it had gotten when I decided to head back home. Upon entering, the same uncomfortable calm had settled over the house. Those spaces we no longer shared in the same way. He was still in his usual spot, absorbed in something on his computer, giving the impression of being busy, but his face showed exhaustion, a deep fatigue that stemmed from more than just the physical. Instead of speaking, I let myself be carried away by the impulse to retreat to my room. And yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were slowly drifting apart, moving imperceptibly along parallel paths that widened the distance between us. The space around us seemed soaked with unresolved differences, as if the very objects that once united us now only marked our separation. The books, the photographs, the memories, all had become silent witnesses to the growing divide. There were no explosive confrontations, no sudden breaks, only a widening chasm of estrangement. A new day began as the night faded away, and weak light filtered through the window's cracks. My thoughts spiraled once more as I struggled to make sense of everything. The question of what it truly meant to be a mother, of what it meant to make a moral decision that would reshape our lives forever, settled over me with a weight that felt mechanical. It was impossible not to feel overwhelmed. Questions sometimes crashed against the walls of reason like shards of glass tumbling into a dark abyss. In just a few hours, we would learn what we were facing at the medical consultation. And though the days moved forward at their own pace, the conflict remained suspended over every one of my movements like a shadow. I was ready to face whatever lay ahead, but deep down, uncertainty still churned. Not so much about the future itself, but about what it meant to acknowledge that, even if everything on the surface remained unchanged, something essential in our relationship had already shifted. The truth was that we could no longer find the words. The ones we needed most always seemed to evade us. We could spend days together, yet always remain distant in some way. Our dreams were no longer the same, our worries no longer spoke the same language. That night, after growing accustomed to the routine of not speaking beyond superficialities, I decided to retrieve something from the closet. However, as I passed by his desk and saw his hands on the keyboard, I felt an unexpected jolt. He acted as if he were typing, but in reality, he was utterly absent. I wasn't looking at him. I was seeing a version of him that only existed in my mind, a projection of what we had been and what we no longer were. I decided to sit down. The music that once played softly throughout our home was no longer a part of our daily life. "Hey, do you want to talk about this again?" I asked, and the moment I did, the air filled with the same uncertainty that had surrounded us all week.